Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Professor Kyle back again. We are going to get started. I forgot to turn on my key light. There we go. We are going to get started with labs 3 and 4, which is going to be the axial skeleton. And I will try to do this relatively more quickly than the last lecture. The last one ended up being the full time. So we'll try to fly through this. First half is going to be the cranial bones, everything to do up here. And then the second half will be on all of the facial bones. Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. First things first, there are many bones to your cranium, 6 primary ones to be exact. These bones are connected through a series of fibrous sutures, and here we see a first couple examples. I'm going to make sure to properly use my pointer this time. First, we'll start off with the coronal suture, which basically means crown in Latin. Runs right along the border between your parietal, the lobes of the two halves of your parietal bone and your frontal bone. So it's going to run right along this region up here. It's called such because you can think in the old days, like Roman paintings and that sort of stuff, you may have seen them wear those wreathed crowns upon their heads, those flowery crowns. They sit roughly in line with where this suture is. Next, we have the squamous suture. It runs along your temples, along the side of your head, right along this area, relatively horizontally oriented. And then lastly, from this angle, we can see the lambdoid suture. It's a weird word. It comes from the Greek letter lambda, as we'll see later, but it runs along the back of your skull. So here are these 6 bones that I mentioned earlier. I'm not going to read off the list because we'll cover each of them in turn, although I will mention at this point that the sphenoid and temporal bones are probably the ones you need to spend the most time reviewing in terms of all of their features and substructures that are relevant for us. So I anticipate spending more time with those. We have 4 major sutures. We covered 3 of these already. Coronal, right, on the crown. Squamous along the side. Lambdoid on the back. Sagittal is on the top. Remember the sagittal plane from our anatomical terms and positions lecture. So we have the sagittal plane cutting across this way. So if you have a suture in your skull that's along that line, we would logically call it the sagittal suture. Makes sense? Here we have a frontal view of a skull illustration. Speaking of frontal, we have the frontal bone, probably the most logically named bone in the skull. So that should be very obvious to all of us. 2 features that we need to note on the frontal bone is the glabella, which is just this little flat area on the front. There's technically, you don't need to know this, but there's actually technically a suture here, but it basically essentially fully fuses into a single frontal bone, and we can see a little remnant of that with this little suture right there. But the glabella is just this flat surface right here in the front of your frontal bone. And then we have the supraorbital foramen, or notch, located right here. Again, these foramen, typically as we see them on the skull, are inlets and outlets. They are tunnels for vasculature. Think like your veins and arteries, as well as for nerves to pass through. We'll see a number of examples in that regard. Back here, we're looking at the sphenoid bone. My apologies, ethmoid is this guy right here, this little orange bit. At the back of the sphenoid bone right here, we have the optical canal. We'll see that on the other side as well when we're looking at the interior of the skull from like a superior to inferior perspective. So we'll note that again there. We see small portions of the temporal bone. We'll cover that in a couple slides more extensively. And other things, okay, the ethmoid. Yeah, the ethmoid, we're going to cover this on its own, but what I want to note right now is that these concha, these 3 plates that we see here, okay, we have the perpendicular plate and then the medial concha. There's technically superior concha, although they are not visualized. They're back in this region. We can see the middle nasal concha and the perpendicular plate. This bit right here, these 3 plates, as well as this little portion on the side where you can see the line being drawn to, those are all portions of the ethmoid bone. And then we have the inferior nasal concha along here. We'll cover that again later. Let's focus in on that frontal bone that I mentioned moments ago. Okay, so we have the supraorbital foramen. slash notch right in this region right here. The squamous part, or the flat part of the frontal bone. The glabella would be right here. It's not noted or illustrated, but it is right here. The orbital portion, so obviously this is where your eyes are. So within the orbits, the upper half essentially is formed by the frontal bone. Again, we typically have nerves and arteries passing through these foramen. Foramina would be the plural. And then glabella is this smooth part right here. Okay. Parietal bone. Okay. So your parietal bone is technically has two halves, but again, they are sutured together, and this forms the sagittal suture at the top of the skull. So this would be up along this region right here. And that's basically all we need to really note from this perspective. So the majority of the two kind of hemispheres, just as you have two hemispheres to your brain, is formed by each halves of the parietal bone, which are joined together by the sagittal suture. Temporal bone, okay. So again, this is one of those more complicated ones you probably need to spend a little bit more time on compared to the others. It's pretty significant. We see it visualized both on both halves of your skull, as well as on the interior, obviously. A couple landmarks that I want to note. We'll start off with the external acoustic meatus right here. So that's this tunnel that my pointer is currently hanging over right there. Good guess. You probably or can tell acoustic meatus being a large hint. This is the outer portion of your ear, right? There's also an internal acoustic meatus, which is the same tunnel. It's the same tube, but just from the interior perspective. So that is where your eardrum resides. Zygomatic process. This is this portion right here. So this is actually, we're going to come to find, this is the zygomatic bone right here. So there's three parts to your cheekbone. There's a small part of the front of the maxilla. We'll cover that later. There's a zygomatic bone, which is its own thing. We'll cover that later as well. And then we have at the posterior portion of your cheekbone is formed by your temporal bone, where your temples are. Think when you get a headache and you massage your temples, right? So there's a process, a point. Process basically means point, right here called the zygomatic process because it attaches to the zygomatic bone. And that's the most posterior portion of your cheekbone. Next, we have the styloid process. You can't feel this, but it's down here on the sides of your skull. It's an attachment point for muscles that help stabilize your neck and allow for articulation. But it's too deep for you to really palpate it properly. Mastoid on the other process, the mastoid process right here, you can feel. My headphone's a little bit in the way, but you can feel it right back here. And again, attachment point for muscles or stabilizing muscles. Other things that we need to note here. We'll see them from a different perspective, but we'll note the jugular foramen and the carotid canal later, right? Cool. Again, and one last thing, the squamous suture. So the temporal bone along with the parietal bone form the majority of the squamous suture. All right, occipital. This is the posterior portion of your skull, the lower posterior portion. It has the lambdoid suture, named for the Greek letter lambda. This is what the Greek letter looks like. And we can see the V shape right here is this portion right here, hence its name. And then somewhat loosely, the sagittal suture is kind of forming the upper portion of the letter, the line. Really important to note, in addition to the lambdoid suture, is the foramen magnum. This guy right here. This is where your spinal column runs through, right? Your spinal cord, and then into the vertebral column runs through the foramen magnum. So please note that. That's an extremely important opening. The occipital crest is this bump. You can kind of palpate it at the center, the medial posterior portion of the occipital bone on the back of your skull. You can feel a bump back there. We'll leave it at that. There's more substructures here, but for our purposes, that's sufficient. Sphenoid bone, this is the other one that I said was rather complicated. Looks something like a butterfly or a bat to me, especially when you have a colored illustration like this. It looks like some sort of insect, like this would be its head. And these are its wings, which they are actually called wings quite conveniently. We have the greater and lesser wings. It's easy to distinguish when it is colorized like this, which the actual bone is not. The easiest way to distinguish that is this portion right here. Think you see this little ridge, okay, shaped like that. These are the lesser wings viewed from more of a superior to inferior perspective. So this line, okay, is that right there. And then lower portions are going to be the greater wings. Next, we'll note the sella turcica, right? It's this little divot right here. We'll see it visualized better on another slide. This is important because this is the location. This is the little special space for the pituitary gland, which is a very significant portion of the endocrine system, essentially hormone regulation, right? Your testosterone, your estrogen levels, as well as a variety of other hormones are regulated by the secretions from the pituitary gland, which resides in the sella turcica. Your luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, those sorts of things. We'll cover that more in depth when we discuss the endocrine system. Then we have the optical canal running right here, adjacent to the lesser wings. Okay, very, very important. We can visualize. So remember I mentioned it earlier. So we're now talking about this sphenoid bone here, right? So this little tunnel right here, the optical canal, visualized from the front, is this visualized from the anterior surface right there. And then the foramen ovale, these feed, there's arteries as well as a nerve. You don't need to know this for the purposes of our test, but it's a portion of the trigeminal nerve, runs through the foramen ovale right here, okay, downwards. Alrighty. Easy to note the name of that one because it's the most oval shaped of these tunnels, right? So that would be, and foramen means basically tunnel or hole. So the oval shaped one is the foramen ovale. Ethmoid. Okay, where the heck is this in the human body? Well, again, this is the one that I said we can't visualize all of it because we have some bones stacked on top of it, but it is right back here. So if we were to take the maxilla off and the nasal bones and the lacrimal bone, we would see the ethmoid in its entirety, which looks something like this. So those plates that we saw in the nasal cavity are these guys right here. So we have the middle nasal concha, and we have the perpendicular plate. We also have ethmoid sinuses. We'll cover the sinuses at the end of this portion of the lecture. There's 4 of them that you need to know, but one of them reside inside of the ethmoid bone. And then 2 important structures, 2 important features of this bone that we should note are the crista galli and the cribriform plate, horizontal plate. Your brain, the hemispheres of your brain, are residing right, your cursor's running away, right up here if I was to draw. Okay, that makes sense. Why is this relevant? Well, the crista galli forms this crest. It roughly translates to something along the lines of like chicken crest or like rooster crest, right? You know, they have those flappy crests on top of a rooster's head. This obviously looks similar in structure, hence its name. This forms an attachment point for a special membrane that basically helps stabilize and separate the hemispheres, so you're less likely to jostle your brain around. So it wraps around the hemispheres and then attaches here. I know you thought you were getting away from my terrible drawings, but I'm still going to use it occasionally. The cribriform plate, on the other hand, are these perforations right here. So it's this relatively flat portion. We'll see it again from another perspective. But these are actually porous tunnels that run from the cranial cavity, from where your brain resides, down into the upper portion of your sinuses. What this accomplishes is that there are olfactory neurons, in other words, sense of smell neurons, that the cell bodies of which reside here, and then they have extensions that run through these tunnels into the upper portions of your sinuses, and this is where the majority of your sense of smell comes from. Okay, and the perpendicular plate is right here. The next bone in the sequence, because this is attached, would be the vomer. We'll talk about the vomer later. Cranial nerve 1 is your olfactory stuff. Alrighty. just there's a bit of redundancy with this PowerPoint, but just different perspectives. We can see that external occipital crest again right here, these series of ridge lines. Why do we have these weird sorts of ridge lines? Well, we've noted it before, but typically when we have a process or similar sorts of structure, imagine rock climbing, right? You're out rock climbing and you're reaching for a handhold. Would you rather that handhold be a flat surface, or get my hand correctly, flat surface, a gentle incline, or like a solid perpendicular grip? I think you would want this, right? If you've ever experienced rock climbing, you want to get a firm grip. These sorts of crests and processes essentially act as those sorts of plates that our muscles and tendons can attach to generate greater leverage. You see the mastoid process right here of temporal bone. Again, we'll see that on the next slide. Side. So that is right here, mastoid process. Again, you can actually palpate that on the back portion behind your jaw. We've already discussed some of these things, but I'll just note them because you need to be able to identify them from the different perspectives. Again, the majority of the upper portion of your skull, the sides of it, is the parietal bone and the temporal bone, rather. We can also see, again, a small portion of that suture on the side, the sagittal suture, is met by the ethmoid bone, pink right here. So again, which one was the ethmoid? The ethmoid was, first of all, this guy right here, pink here, pink there, right? So just connect those dots in your head. Occipital bone on the back, zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Again, this is the posterior portion of your cheek, running into the zygomatic bone, which we'll talk about very soon in a more extensive process. And then we have the styloid process, which looks like a stylus, looks like a pen poking downwards. It would be about here, but you can't really feel that. Same idea, just with an actual cadaver skull model as opposed to a animated illustration. I could go off on tangents of physiology and clinical application, but I know you guys are just focused on what you need to know for the exam, and you don't need to know those things for the exam. Alrighty, so here we are looking superior to inferior. So similarly to how most of the models that you've probably played with are set up, there's a cut in the transverse plane. So let's take a look here. Again, we can see that ethmoid bone, and we can see the cristagalate and the cribriform plate right here. So this individual is looking, they're oriented, they're facing this way, okay? So up for them is the direction that they're facing, so their eyes would be located like right here. What else do we need to note from this perspective? Well, the main things here are going to be, at this point, you're probably fairly confident in identifying which bone is which plate. But now we need to really focus in on these tunnels, these foramen. Okay, so again, we can note in the sphenoid bone, right at the edge of the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone, we can see the optical canal, which would run into the orbits right here for the eyes. We see the telocella turcica, again, right here. This is where that sac containing the pituitary gland would be, right here. The two halves of the temporal bone, right here, with the jugular foramen, and then it's not noted, but this would be the carotid canal right here. And what else do we need to know of superior perspective? The foramen magnum, again, spinal cord runs through this. Please know that. Leave it there for now. Same thing with the model, physical model. Nothing really extra there. And then from an inferior to superior perspective, minus the mandible, you don't have your jaw here getting in the way. Couple things to note that we haven't seen before. We have the mandibular fossa. Okay, mandibular fossa. It's these plate regions right here. Some models will actually have a separate sort of plastic here to suggest cartilage, because these have cartilage lining the edge of them. This forms the upper portion of the joint for your jaw, right? Where you hinge against there. If I was to look right here. So basically, from an inferior perspective, looking upwards, we're looking at this region right here, where the mandible interfaces and forms a joint with the temporal bone right here. So this would be the temporal bone right here, mandibular fossa. We have the mastoid process again on the side right here, but we're just looking up at it. Here we can see the carotid canal along with the jugular foramen. The best way to find and note which tunnels these are, which foramen these are, is go ahead and just find that styloid process, that relatively pointy one, just anterior to the mastoid process. Okay, so this is the mastoid process. We have that styloid process, that very pointy one. Go ahead and find that. And then if you're looking at that, that will tell you exactly where the carotid canal and the jugular foramen are because they are right adjacent to it. Styloid process is right here. So we have the carotid canal just anterior and the jugular foramen will be just posterior to that. Helpful little trick to identify those. And everything else we've covered a couple times. Again, just noting an illustration. I should perhaps have those reversed, those two slides reversed. But we see the carotid canal. This would be the styloid process right here. We have the jugular foramen. So carotid canal, think carotid artery as being the primary thing running through that. Jugular foramen, think jugular vein being one of the main things. That's not exclusively the only things that run through that, but those are the main structures. Anything else that we need to note here? No, we've basically covered all these. Cool. Congratulations, that's the end of part 1. So those are our cranial bones. Next, we're going to cover our facial bones. Alrighty, continuing right along. So now we are going to focus in on the facial bones and the vertebral column as opposed to the cranial bones that we just covered. Again, just to orient ourselves, these are the bones of the cranium, a couple sutures. Please know these. We have the coronal suture along the top, the squamous suture along the side, the lambdoid suture along the back, the posterior portion of the skull. But now we're going to focus in, we've covered those, we're going to focus in on these facial bones right here. What are the facial bones? Well, here's a list of the facial bones. I'm not going to read it off because we're going to cover each of these in turn. Although I will note at this point that the mandible and the maxilla are probably the ones that are going to require the most amount of study because they generally have the most features that we need to know. Here's that same frontal illustration that we have seen before, except now we are emphasizing some different structures. We'll go top to bottom right here. We'll start off with the nasal bone, which is technically two halves that are fused together along this midline suture, this sagittal plane. This forms the top portion of your nose right here, the lower portion obviously being flexible because it's formed from cartilage rather than bone. Next, we have the lacrimal bone. It is this little green guy right here that we can see visualized on both halves. It's not super obvious its shape or function from this perspective, but do note that it is placed essentially in between the ethmoid bone, which we've discussed previously during the cranium, as well as the maxilla. So it's this medial portion of the orbital space for your eye, but it sits in between the ethmoid, which is the more posterior portion, as well as the maxilla, which is the more anterior portion. Next, we have the zygomatic bone, which we've discussed fairly extensively because we've discussed the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, which would be this tiny little edge right here. So again, your cheekbone is, to say cheekbone is actually a little bit of a misnomer, right? Because we actually know that it's 3 bones, not 1 bone. The first one we discussed, which was, or the first portion was in the cranium, which is the temporal bone. So that has the zygomatic process. The second is the zygomatic bone itself, which forms the majority of it. And then the last portion, the most frontal portion of it, is technically formed by the maxilla right here, this process right here. Speaking of the maxilla, though, we'll discuss this more on its own slide, but for now, just note the infraorbital foramen located right here on either side, and note that in connection to the supraorbital foramen of the frontal bone that we discussed earlier, right? So if there's orbital canals and we have something with supra, meaning above, then there's probably something that is sub or infra, meaning below. So the supraorbital we discussed previously. Now we're discussing the infraorbital, which is located on the maxilla. And then lastly, we have the mandible, right? We have the jaw. Listed here are 2 structures, the mandibular symphysis, which is this protrusion, this bony protrusion right here on the front. You can usually palpate that and feel it. Contributes to the formation of a bit of a dimple that some people have more than others. And then lastly, we have the mental foramen. So there are two foramen that we need to know on the mandible. But given that it is the mandible, these are oftentimes confused. Students will see this and be like, "Oh, this is a foramen on the mandible, so this must be the mandibular foramen." They are partially correct. There is a mandibular foramen, or there are mandibular foramen, I should say. But these ones located on the anterior surface are the mental foramen. Those are not the mandibular. We'll see the mandibular later. So please remember that those are the mental foramen. Speaking of the mandible, we have a number of different structures. Don't get too overwhelmed with this list. We'll look at it on an illustration, and it'll make a lot more sense there. We'll start off with this condylar process, but we'll focus in on this one because it makes a little bit more sense in context over here. So we have the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, right, which we noted previously as being located right here, right, this portion of the so this is a temporal bone. So we have a mandibular fossa, this flat surface on the underside of it, and that interfaces and forms a joint with the condylar process of the mandible, and that is the hinging portion of your jaw joint. Moving down from the condylar process, we have the ramus of the mandible, which is the relatively more vertically oriented portion of your jaw, right? And the ramus meets with the body of the mandible, which is the flat portion of your jawline, right? And when those two lines meet, when the ramus and the body of the mandible meet, those two lines form an angle. And so we therefore call the point that they meet at the mandibular angle, right? Naming conventions that make sense. We love that. All right, we already discussed mandibular fossa. The temporomandibular joint would be a fancy name to note both aspects of it. Next, we have this coronoid process, which is this guy right here. This guy right here. Fun fact, this runs under that zygomatic process that we discussed before at length. What is its function? Well, it's an attachment point for muscles of the face to allow for your jaw to open and close with sufficient force. So again, it's an attachment point. It anchors muscles. Now we can discuss the mandibular foramen. So again, these holes on the front of the mandible, these foramen on the front, those are the mental processes, or I'm sorry, mental foramen. On the interior surface of the mandible, we have the mandibular foramen. Okay. And then lastly, we have these things called the alveolar process or alveolar processes, right? It's essentially just defining these ridge lines in between where your teeth reside. So we therefore see an equivalent structure. We have alveolar processes of both the mandible as well as the maxilla for your upper teeth. Right? Here's just an illustration of what we've just discussed, but in conjunction with the cranium. So again, that we have the mandibular notch where the condylar process is interfacing with the fossa, mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. The mandibular angle is this point right here. And then we have the coronoid process running under the zygomatic bone, the zygomatic process for attachment of muscles to allow your jaw to open and close with strong force. Here we get a little bit of a better perspective on that lacrimal bone that I was mentioning earlier. So again, like kind of the medial surface of the orbit of the eye is formed by three bones. We have the maxilla as the most anterior portion, and then we have the lacrimal, as well as then the ethmoid would be the little bit of orange that we can see there. Then we have the lacrimal fossa as well as the lacrimal foramen. Kind of, you can't see the foramen necessarily right here, but think of your tear ducts and lacrimation, or your lacrimal glands. They would reside here. And the lacrimal foramen would actually run into the nasal passage. So it's a common example I've mentioned before of, if you were to cry, right, you may have noticed that when you cry, oftentimes you get a stuffy nose, and that's due in part to some of your tears are running through that lacrimal foramen, located right next to the lacrimal fossa, that runs into your sinuses, and so you're essentially sneezing out. You're essentially sneezing out some of your tears that way. Then we see the alveolar process again noted on both the mandible as well as the maxilla. Everything else we've discussed previously. Same image or same points, but on a cadaver model. the maxilla or maxillate, because it's technically two halves that are sutured together, as many other bones of the skull are. We'll discuss each of these in part on a separate slide where it'll make a little bit more sense. So we have that zygomatic process of now the maxilla, right? So this is the most frontal portion of your cheekbone. It would be then running from here to this direction. This would be where your cheek is, right here. There. Orbital surface of the maxilla, so your eye is right here. And then the infraorbital foramen that we noted before, supraorbital, would be somewhere right around here on the frontal bone. And then the alveolar processes that we spoke about previously. All right, looking inferior to superior at the facial bones. We have the hard palate. Hard palate meaning is formed by bone. There is a soft palate, a little bit more posterior, which is cartilaginous in structure, which is advantageous because it's flexible. So since it's very close to where you're swallowing, that flexibility makes it less likely for you to choke. But the frontal portion of your palate is hard bone. It's composed of two different bones. We have the maxilla, which we have discussed at length, and then which forms the anterior 2/3. And if there's an anterior 2/3, then there's a posterior 1/3. And that posterior 1/3 is the palatine bone right here. Palatine bone. We've mentioned it before verbally, but now we're actually seeing it noted as an illustrated point. We have the vomer, this blue guy right here. Where is this vomer? Well, the best example I can give you right here is this guy right here. So again, we have the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, and we have this little process, this little point right here of the maxilla. Bridging that gap between those two is the vomer, this blue bone right there. So that's what we're seeing right here. We have the incisive fossa, this little hole on your hard palate in between the two halves of your maxilla. And then we have that intermediate suture, right? Again, because these are technically two bones that are sutured together. And other points that we've noted before. Okay, there's a palatine suture between the palatine bone and the maxilla. Lacrimal bone, we mentioned it earlier. It was that green guy on the prior slide, and with the lacrimal fossa, which holds the lacrimal sac, along with, technically, there's the lacrimal foramen, which it would be the tube specifically to drain tears into the nasal cavity. Palatine bone, again, we've noted this before. This image isn't necessarily the best, but there are technically two foramen on the palatine bone. There is the greater and lesser palatine foramen. Greater is going to be the larger one. Lesser is going to be the smaller one. No need to overthink that. Again, for the purposes of nerve passage as well as your vasculature, veins, and arteries. Then we have the zygomatic bone. We've discussed this previously. So if we have this zygomatic bone and it is attaching to other bones with pointy bits, we would typically call those processes, right? So how do we name this? Well, previously, again, we've noted the temporal bone has the zygomatic process because that is the portion of the temporal bone that attaches to the zygomatic bone. Looking from the other perspective, so that's temporal to zygomatic, if we have the zygomatic bone with a pointy bit, a process connecting back towards the temporal bone, we would therefore call that the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Makes sense? So it's just naming conventions in reverse of each other. Again, this forms the majority of your cheekbone. Nasal bone right here, ridge of the hard ridge of your nose. I mentioned it a while ago when we were talking about the glabella, which, again, the glabella is this flat surface right here in the lower frontal portion of the frontal bone. You can see the atopic suture is right here, this little remnant of it. Technically, this originally, during like embryological or fetal development, the suture connected all the way up to the sagittal suture that we still see up here. But these two hemispheres of the frontal bone fuse completely during, usually prior to about 8 months old, somewhere around there. That's just fun fact. If it's not written down, you don't really need to know. We have the vomer we discussed previously. Again, this little guy right here. It's connecting the perpendicular plate to the maxilla. Okay, single bone, inferior portion of the nasal septum. And then we have the inferior nasal concha located here on the side. Anything else we really need to know? Again, they're technically superior nasal concha, but they are very difficult to visualize with these other bones in place, so we're not going to worry about that. We're going to finish things off with the sinuses, and then we'll talk about vertebrae. So we have 4 sinuses that we need to know. We have the frontal sinus, which reside inside of the frontal bone. We have the ethmoid air cells, or ethmoid sinus, really. Let's just keep things simple. And we have the sphenoidal sinuses. The ethmoid and sphenoid sinuses are located in front of, or ethmoid is located more anterior or in front of the sphenoidal sinuses because they're located within their respective bones. We'll see that more on the next slide. And then we have the maxillary sinuses, these guys right here. So oftentimes if you've had a sinus infection, you might have noted that you feel some degree of relief if you massage these regions of your face. That's because you're essentially applying a minute amount of pressure that might relax some of the mucosal buildup or pressure within these sinuses. Again, here we can see that the ethmoid, again, being in the ethmoid bone, is more anterior to the sphenoidal sinuses. I'm really not covering any physiology in this lecture because I want to keep things as simple and as quick as possible. In class, we discuss more of the physiological function of sinuses. Now we will discuss vertebrae. Okay, so there are technically 5 portions to the vertebral column. However, the articulating ones, the ones that we generally care about the most, there are 3 groups. We have the cervical, of which there are 7, C1 through C7. Then we have the thoracic, which forms where the rib cage attaches to, thoracic vertebrae. Then we have the lumbar, which is your lower back. This is a common point of complaint for many individuals. Oh, lower back pain, usually coming from the lumbar region. And then we have the sacral and the coccyx. We'll cover those briefly at the end. But first, we should start off with some general features of these vertebral bones. It's been a long day when I'm recording this. First and foremost, we have the body. We have this large plate right here. Bonus points if you call it the centrum. Body, this is where the vertebral discs would stack on top of each other. This is where all of the support and all of the load-bearing capacity of the spinal column is located and handled. Then we have a very important structure called the vertebral foramen, this guy right here. You can probably guess what runs through this tunnel, what runs through this hole right here. Correct, yeah, it is your spinal column. It's your spinal column. So just as we had the foramen magnum in the base of the occipital bone, which is where your spinal cord starts or originates from your cranium, it then runs through the vertebral foramen down through your spine. Then we have these structures running along the side. So again, this individual would be oriented just to make sure we're all on the same page. This individual, oh, that's not a very straight line. This individual is facing that way. So this is towards their back. This is the posterior, again, anterior to posterior. Alrighty, we have on the side, we have these transverse processes. Physiological, in terms of physiological function, the most obvious application of this is for the thoracic portion of your vertebral column. These have these condyles, these fossa right here, which are attachment points for the heads of your ribs to attach to the spine. All vertebrae have these transverse processes, but that's just one example of the physiological function of them. And then on the very back, we have the spinous process, and these are those ridge lines that you can feel on the back of your spine if you palpate it. And then the intervertebral foramen is not an actual hole in the bone. It's more of a consequence of the stacking of vertebrae on top of each other, but it is the gap that forms between essentially the spinal processes of stacked vertebrae. So those are the ones we'll know for now. Superior and inferior articular processes are the attachment points, or the articulation points rather, between stacked vertebrae. So we would see examples of that sort of joint essentially right here. These are most significant on the lumbar region, where you don't have attachment for thoracic vertebrae, so the transverse processes aren't serving that function. but you do have a significant amount of load that you want to keep stabilized. And so those interactions between stacked vertebrae become very, very significant. So these superior and inferior articular processes are very significant on those. Here's just another illustration of what we were previously discussing. Again, vertebral foramen. This is where, what are we talking about? We're talking about a vertebrae. What are we looking at? Well, it's a hole, it's a tunnel. What do we call holes and tunnels? We call them foramen. So this is the vertebral foramen that your spinal cord runs through. Then we have the superior articular facet, which is the plate itself right here. And then the process is just kind of the overall structure. Again, this is how they stack and orient on top of each other to accomplish specific angles of movement. And then we have these transverse processes. And we'll note on the next slide the differences between the vertebrae because we really emphasize these as ways to distinguish between them. So how do we distinguish between them? Well, a couple different ways. We'll start off with cervical because cervical is the most self-evident type of vertebrae. Thoracic and lumbar can somewhat be more difficult to distinguish between. How is it easy to tell a cervical from the rest? Well, on the transverse processes, on these more laterally oriented processes, we have transverse foramen. We have holes in these, okay? On thoracic and lumbar, we do not have transverse foramen. There are no, it would look, the equivalent thing would be something like this. This would have to be closed off, and then we would have a foramen. But we don't have that on anything other than cervical vertebrae, okay? Keep laser pointer on. Again, everything has superior and inferior articular facets. Noted before. Articular processes, spinal processes. Thoracic, we see those transverse costal facets. These are the attachment points for the rib cage. Again, this individual would be facing this way. Okay, so this would be their posterior portion. This is their anterior portion. So you can imagine their rib cage is essentially doing something like this. That is not at all to scale, but that is the orientation. And then lastly, we have lumbar. So how do we kind of generally distinguish this? One other rule, in addition to looking for these particular features, really more of a guideline, not so much a rule. One other guideline is to look at not only the features of the vertebrae, but just look at their general structure. What you'll note is that typically when we are higher up in the spinal column, okay, when we are in this cervical region up here, think of your spinal cord as an information highway, right? So if we're up here at the base of the head, okay, all of the information, all the sensory motor neurons and everything else, all has to be running through that same canal down to the rest of the body. So there's a lot of information that needs to be disseminated and communicated and sent back and forth to the rest of the body. By the time you drop down all the way into your lumbar region, we've had tons and tons of nerves shunting off, leaving the spinal column to go to wherever their destination is. So there's less information that needs to get processed and transmitted in this lower region. The way that translates is you typically see that you'll typically notice that the vertebral foramen is larger, especially in proportion, for cervical and thoracic vertebrae than it is for lumbar vertebrae. So there's less information to carry down here than there is up here. Conversely, think of the sense in terms of physical or mechanical load bearing. Okay, we're up here at this top portion of the cervical vertebrae. All we are really supporting is your head, and although your head is fairly large and fairly heavy, there's really not much more weight outside of that. As we move down, we're accommodating and we're carrying more and more of a significant load, particularly by the time we reach the lumbar region. By the time we reach the lumbar region, we are fully supporting our arms and our upper half of our body, so that's a significant amount of weight. But our lumbar region also needs to be able to support any additional weight that we, by picking things up, decide to carry and add that additional load onto it. So the body of lumbar vertebrae tends to be much, much larger relative to, say, cervical. Should be good right there. Again, cervical vertebrae, we have these transverse processes. We're just going to run through this and note the key differences. We often have a bifurcated or sort of a wishbone shape to the spinal process as well on the cervical vertebrae. But again, that transverse foramen is going to be the single biggest giveaway as to what you were looking at. Next, we have thoracic vertebrae. So we have those superior and inferior costal facets for the stacking process, kind of like a Lego stacking of vertebrae. But the specific distinguishing feature is going to be these transverse costal facets for rib cage attachment. Also, we note the very significant spinal process that is also tends to be angled, kind of like scales on like a dragon or a dinosaur. They tend to stack quite nicely with each other. So we can see like right here. And then we have lumbar vertebrae, which have very large bodies. Okay, again, we don't have those transverse costal facets that we noted earlier. We do have superior and inferior articular facets, however, for that load-bearing function. There. Intervertebral disc, we're not going to break this down too extensively. Just note that these are formed from cartilage, these intervertebral discs, and they are intended to accommodate a certain degree of flexibility and stretch or elastic. But primarily they're composed of fibrocartilage, which again has components of elastic and other forms of cartilage, primarily to absorb shock and accommodate load bearing. We'll just leave it at that. We won't break down the layers more than that. Just another example, comparative illustration of our different types of vertebrae. And then lastly, we're not going to break this down too far, but just please note, please note that the lower portion of the spinal column is the sacral and the coccyx, right? Okay. These vertebrae fuse during early childhood development. Particular comments I'm not going to do. Okay, one little quick physiological application. A common point of injury, especially for elderly individuals, is to quote unquote break your tailbone, right? From a common injury in the form of a fall or hip cracks, as well as breaking the tailbone or the coccyx off. These become more frail over time. But these vertebrae fuse, they don't articulate in any significant way. Your hips would be around these sides here. So note the sacrum and the coccyx, and we'll leave it at that. With that being said, congratulations. We are now done with lecture, and at this point, finish your studying, and we are fully prepared for practicum 1. Hope things go well.